A Mafia boss came home early and couldn't believe what his eyes were seeing. Alexander Russo was used to coming home after 10 p.m., when everyone in the mansion was already fast asleep. As the most feared man in New York's underworld, his nights were filled with meetings, deals, and shadows that ordinary people would never understand. But tonight, the negotiation in Brooklyn had wrapped up earlier than expected, and he decided to head straight home without telling anyone. When he pushed open the door of his Upper East Side mansion, Alexander froze right there in the doorway. His mind struggled to make sense of the scene before him. In the middle of the living room, Grace, the 27-year-old housekeeper, was kneeling on the wet floor with a rag in her hand. But that wasn't what made him stop breathing. It was the scene right beside her. His son Lucas, only 4 years old, was standing on his tiny purple crutches, holding a kitchen towel in his small hands, trying to help her clean the floor. "Aunt Grace, I can clean this part right here," the little boy with sandy brown hair said, stretching his small arm out with visible effort. "Easy there, little one. You've helped me so much today already. How about you sit on the couch and rest while I finish up?" Grace replied in a gentle voice that Alexander had never heard before. "But I want to help." "You always say we're a team," the boy insisted, struggling to keep his balance on the crutches. Alexander stood there, silently watching without being noticed. There was something about this scene that touched his heart in a way he couldn't explain. Lucas was smiling, something the powerful Mafia boss rarely saw at home. "All right, my little helper, but just a little bit more, okay?" Grace accepted the boy's help with a warm smile. At that exact moment, Lucas spotted his father standing at the door. His little face lit up, but in those blue eyes, there was a mixture of surprise and fear. "Daddy, you're home early," the boy exclaimed, trying to turn around quickly and almost losing his balance. If you're enjoying this story, don't forget to hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to hear this. Subscribe to the channel so you won't miss what happens next. Grace jolted to her feet the instant she saw her employer, the cleaning rag slipping from her hand and dropping onto the wet floor. She hurriedly lowered her head, both hands unconsciously worrying the corner of her white apron, her whole body trembling with fear. "Good evening, Mr. Russo. I didn't know you'd be home early." "I was just finishing up the cleaning," Grace stammered, her voice shrinking as if she were trying to make herself as small as possible. She didn't dare lift her head to look at the powerful man standing in front of her, and in her mind there was only one thought. She was about to be fired. Lucas had regained his balance on his small crutches by then, and the boy tried to move toward his father with a face that held both joy and worry at once. His clear blue eyes kept flicking back and forth between his father and Grace, as though he were trying to guess what was about to happen. Alexander walked into the living room, his expensive leather shoes making soft taps against the wooden floor. He looked at Grace, then at Lucas, then back at Grace. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice calm but so stern it seemed to freeze the air in the room. Before Grace could open her mouth, Lucas cut in immediately. "Daddy, please don't be mad at Aunt Grace," the boy blurted, his voice quick with anxiety. "She didn't do anything wrong, I promise." Grace felt as if her heart were about to leap out of her chest. She knew who Mr. Russo was. She knew what happened to people who worked for him when they made a mistake. In 8 months here, she'd always tried to be invisible, to draw no attention, to complete her work as perfectly as she could. But now she was standing in the middle of the living room with his son, and she didn't know whether she'd even get the chance to explain. "Mr. Russo, I'm so sorry. I can explain. I didn't mean to overstep. She stammered, the words tangling and knotting in her mind. And then something unexpected happened. Lucas, the 4-year-old boy with purple crutches, suddenly broke into a radiant smile. "Daddy, guess what?" he shouted, completely forgetting the tension in the room. "I stood by myself for almost 5 minutes today. 5 whole minutes without my crutches." Alexander went still. He stared at his son, eyes widening in shock. "What did you say?" "Aunt Grace taught me," Lucas went on, his voice swelling with pride. "She teaches me exercises every day. Look, Daddy, look at my legs. They're getting stronger." The boy tried to lift one foot off the floor to prove it, nearly losing his balance again. Grace rushed forward to steady him, but then she realized what she was doing and immediately stepped back, lowering her head even further. Alexander felt as if someone had just driven a fist into his chest. 8 months. This girl had worked here 8 months, and during all that time she'd been quietly doing physical therapy with his son without him knowing. He, a man who held an entire shadow empire in his hands, a man for whom nothing happened in this city without his knowledge, hadn't known that his own son was learning to walk again under the roof of his own home. Exercises? Alexander asked, his voice dropping lower. What exercises? He looked straight at Grace, and for the first time she was forced to lift her head and meet her employer's gaze. Her brown eyes were full of fear, but there was something else, too. A spark of determination, an instinctive protectiveness for the small boy standing beside her. Mr. Russo, I can explain, she began, her voice shaking. Alexander lifted a hand, signaling her to be quiet. He turned to Lucas, his face giving nothing away. Lucas, he said, gentler now when speaking to his son, go to your room. Daddy needs to talk to Miss Grace alone. But Daddy, Lucas started to protest, his eyes turning to Grace, brimming with worry. Now Lucas. The boy looked at Grace, and she tried to give him a reassuring smile, even as panic churned inside her. She gave a small nod, as if telling him everything would be all right. Lucas turned reluctantly, leaning on his crutches as he headed toward the stairs. He moved very slowly, glancing back now and then, until he disappeared at the top of the staircase. And now there was only Alexander and Grace left in the vast living room, the silence so thick it felt impossible to breathe. Alexander stood a few steps away from Grace, his sharp, ice-cold eyes studying the young woman with her head bowed before him. He could see her shoulders trembling faintly, her fingers still worrying the corner of her apron without stopping. Tell me about these exercises, Alexander said, his voice cold but not quite angry. It was the voice of someone trying to understand, trying to fit the pieces together. Grace drew a deep breath, forcing herself to steady. I do physical therapy exercises with Lucas every day, sir, she began, her voice still shaking. During my lunch break. I've been doing it since I started working here. 8 months ago. Alexander folded his arms across his chest, silent as he waited for her to continue. Grace understood she had no choice but to tell the whole truth. The exercises help strengthen his leg muscles, she explained, her voice gradually growing steadier as she spoke about what she knew. They improve his balance, his coordination. We started with very simple movements, just a few minutes each day. Now Lucas can do much more. He's been making incredible progress. Alexander remained silent, his face giving away nothing, but inside he was trying to process it. 8 months, every day, on her lunch break. Why? He asked, his voice dropping. You don't get paid extra for this. That was when Grace lifted her head, meeting her employer's eyes directly for the first time. Her brown eyes glimmered, no longer filled with fear, but with something deeper. I know, sir, she said, gentle but certain. I couldn't watch him be sad anymore. Alexander tipped his head slightly, signaling for her to go on. And Grace, as if she'd carried these things inside for far too long, began to tell him. When I first came here, I noticed Lucas would sit by the window in his room for hours, she said, her gaze drifting as if she were looking into a distant memory. He would watch the other children playing in the park across the street, running, jumping, chasing each other, and he would just watch, with this look on his face that broke my heart. She paused, swallowing hard. One day, I heard him talking to himself. He was saying, I wish I could run like them, just once. I wish I could run. Alexander felt something tighten around his heart. He hadn't known his son wanted that. And then, Grace continued, her voice smaller now. One afternoon, I came to clean his room and I found him crying, all alone. He was holding a picture of other kids playing soccer, and he was crying so quietly, like he didn't want anyone to hear. She shook her head, as if trying to chase away that painful image. A child shouldn't look that lonely, Mr. Russo. A child shouldn't have to cry alone in his room. The room fell into silence again. Alexander felt as if someone had just slapped him across the face. His son, his 4-year-old son, had cried alone in his room, and he hadn't known a thing. Where had he been? What had he been doing while Lucas sat by the window, wishing he could run and play like the other kids? The answer came at once, sharp in his mind. He'd been in Brooklyn, in Manhattan, anywhere except home with his son. Where is Victoria? He demanded abruptly, a harsh edge cutting into his voice. If he hadn't known these things about Lucas, then surely his wife, the one who was home more, must have known. Grace lowered her head slightly at the question. Mrs. Victoria went out with her friends this afternoon, sir, she replied, careful, as if trying not to say too much. She said she'd be back late. Alexander didn't speak, but his jaw tightened. Victoria, his wife, Lucas's mother, out with friends while her son was at home with the housekeeper. It wasn't the first time. He knew that. Victoria always had spa days, shopping trips, parties with friends. And Lucas had Grace, a 27-year-old housekeeper. he hadn't even truly spoken to until today. A bitter truth rose in Alexander's mind. This housekeeper knew his son better than he did. She knew where Lucas liked to sit, what he dreamed of, when he cried. She knew how to make Lucas laugh, how to help him grow stronger. And him? What did he know about his own son? Alexander looked at Grace, and for the first time, he truly looked at her. Not the way you look at hired help, but the way you look at a human being. This young woman, her hands smudged from scrubbing floors, her brown hair slipping loose from its clip, had done what all the expensive doctors he'd hired hadn't managed to do. She'd made Lucas believe he could walk. "How did you know what exercises to do?" Alexander asked, and now his voice carried a different note. No longer cold, no longer threatening, only a real, unguarded curiosity. Grace hesitated at Alexander's question. She bit her lip, as if weighing how much she ought to say. But then, looking into the man's eyes, she realized this wasn't the moment to hide anything. "I have a younger brother," she began, her voice gentle, yet carrying so many memories. "His name is Daniel. He's 17 now." She paused, drew a deep breath, and continued. "Daniel was born with a congenital defect in his legs. The doctors said he'd never walk normally. They said we should just accept it." Alexander listened in silence, not interrupting. Something in the way Grace spoke made him want to hear more. "I was 10 years old when Daniel was born," Grace went on, her gaze drifting as if she were looking toward a faraway place. "I remember holding him in my arms for the first time. He was so tiny, so fragile. And I remember thinking, I will protect him. I will help him, no matter what." She smiled, a sad smile threaded with pride. "For the past 17 years, I've been taking Daniel to hospitals, to physical therapy sessions, to every specialist we could afford. I watched every exercise the therapist did with him. I asked questions. I took notes. I learned everything I could." Grace lifted her head to Alexander, her brown eyes shining. "I've spent half my life learning how to help my brother walk, Mr. Russo. Every exercise I do with Lucas, I learned from those years with Daniel." Alexander felt something stirring inside him. This young woman, the one he'd only ever known as the housekeeper, had spent 17 years caring for her brother. 17 years of learning, sacrifice, stubborn perseverance. "Why are you working as a housekeeper?" he asked abruptly, the question escaping before he could stop it. "With that kind of experience, you could work in healthcare, in a hospital, in a rehabilitation center." Grace laughed, a soft sound laced with a bitterness Alexander had never heard on anyone else. "Because I don't have a degree, Mr. Russo," she replied, calm as if she were commenting on the weather. "I was in my second year of physical therapy school when I had to drop out." Alexander frowned. "Why?" Grace looked down at her hands, roughened from too much housework. "My father died when I was 8, she said, her tone flat, as if she'd told this story too many times. "Construction accident. The company didn't pay any compensation. They said it was his fault." She stopped, swallowing hard. "My mother, Sarah, she has chronic heart disease. She can't work, can't do anything too strenuous. After my father died, I became the one who took care of everyone. Daniel, my mother, the bills, everything." Alexander stood there, silent. He, a man who controlled hundreds of millions of dollars, was listening to the story of a girl who'd lost everything when she was still a child. "I worked part-time jobs all through high school," Grace continued. "Waitressing, cleaning, babysitting. Anything I could do to save money for college. And I made it. I got into physical therapy school. I thought finally things were going to be different." The smile on her mouth faded. "But then my mother's condition got worse. The medical bills piled up. Daniel needed more treatments. And I had to choose." She lifted her head, meeting Alexander's eyes with a courage he hadn't expected. "I chose my family, Mr. Russo. I dropped out of school and got whatever job I could find. Cleaning houses pays well, and the hours are flexible enough for me to take care of my mother and brother." Alexander felt ashamed, a strange sensation he rarely experienced. He, the most powerful man in New York, had hired the most expensive doctors for his son and hadn't bothered to care about the results. And this young woman, with nothing but her hands and her heart, had done what his money couldn't. "I learned everything from hospitals and YouTube videos, Mr. Russo," Grace added, her voice touched with a hint of self-mockery. "But that doesn't count toward any official degree. In the eyes of the world, I'm just a housekeeper, nothing more." Silence settled over the room. Alexander didn't know what to say. Every sentence he could think of sounded hollow, meaningless beside her story. Grace glanced toward the staircase where Lucas had disappeared a few minutes earlier. And when she looked back at Alexander, there was a strangely gentle light in her eyes. "Lucas has a warrior's heart, Mr. Russo," she said, her voice full of tenderness. "He never gives up, even when it hurts, even when the exercises make him cry. He wipes his tears and tries again, and again, and again." She paused, as if holding her emotions in check. "I just wanted to see him smile, Mr. Russo. A child should smile every day, every single day." And in that moment, Alexander Russo, the notorious New York Mafia boss, felt as if his heart were breaking apart, not from pain, but from the realization of how much he'd missed. His son had the heart of a champion, and he hadn't even known it. Late at night, the mansion sank into silence. Alexander sat alone in his study, the whiskey in his glass already half gone, but he didn't feel like taking another sip. The desk lamp cast his shadow onto the wall, a solitary figure in a vast room filled with expensive paintings and lavish furniture. Grace's words kept echoing in his head, refusing to let him go. "Lucas has a warrior's heart. A child should smile every day." He closed his eyes, and memories came rushing back like a flood. He remembered the day the doctor called with Lucas's diagnosis. "Mr. Russo, I'm afraid your son has a congenital condition affecting his legs. He will need extensive physical therapy. And even then, we can't guarantee." What had he done when he heard that? He remembered clearly. He'd called his assistant and ordered him to hire the best doctors, the top specialists, spend whatever it took. Then he'd hung up and gone to a meeting about a deal he couldn't even remember now. His son had been diagnosed with a disability, and he'd gone to a meeting. Alexander opened his eyes and stared at the whiskey glass. More memories kept surfacing. Nights when he came home late, stepping lightly past Lucas's room because the boy was already asleep. Mornings when he left early, catching only a brief glimpse of his son's door closed tight and quiet. He'd never read Lucas a bedtime story, never sat down to play with him for more than 10 minutes, never asked how school had been that day, what Lucas was thinking, what he dreamed about. A question suddenly rose in his mind, sharp as a knife. When was the last time he'd heard Lucas laugh? He tried to remember. He tried to dig through his mind for a moment, a sound, an image, but he found nothing. He couldn't remember. A man who held an entire empire in his hands, a man who could make anyone in this city tremble, couldn't remember the last time his own son had laughed. The sound of the front door opening yanked Alexander out of his thoughts. He looked at the clock. The hands pointed to 2 o'clock in the morning. A giggle floated down the hallway, high heels clacking against the marble floor. "Victoria? Oh my God, that was so funny." Her voice rang out, slightly slurred with alcohol. No, I'm home now. I'll call you tomorrow, okay? Bye. Love you." Alexander stood in the doorway of his study, watching his wife stumble along the hall. The expensive dress, the 6-inch heels, the designer handbag, and a drunken smile on her lips. Victoria didn't even see him. She went straight up the stairs, still laughing to herself about something on the phone. Not one question about Lucas. Not one glance toward their son's room. Nothing at all. Alexander watched her disappear at the top of the staircase, and he understood a truth he'd been deliberately ignoring for far too long. They'd been drifting apart for a long time. Victoria wasn't the woman he'd married 5 years ago. Or maybe she'd never been that woman. He'd just been too busy to notice. When Victoria's footsteps had completely faded, Alexander quietly went upstairs. But instead of turning into the master bedroom, he stopped in front of the door covered with glow in the dark stars. Lucas's room. He eased the door open and stepped inside. A moon-shaped nightlight cast a soft, gentle glow over the small bed. Lucas slept deeply. Slightly curly brown hair spilled across the pillow. His lips parted. But what made Alexander go still was what the boy was holding in his arms. A kitchen towel. The kitchen towel Lucas had used to help Grace mop the floor that afternoon. The boy held it as if it were the most precious thing in the world, as if it were a medal for the first victory of a tiny, brave boy. Alexander felt something wet on his cheek. He lifted a hand and realized it was tears. For the first time in years, since the day his father died, Alexander Russo cried. He cried without a sound, standing there in the darkness, watching his son sleep. He cried for all the years he'd missed. He cried for the laughter he'd never heard. He cried because this boy, his tiny fighter, had been fighting alone while he was away. He knelt beside the bed and gently stroked Lucas's soft hair. The child shifted, hugged the kitchen towel tighter, but didn't wake. "I'm sorry, little hero," Alexander whispered, his voice rough with tears. "Daddy's been so blind, so stupid. But I promise you, I promise, Daddy will do better. From now on, Daddy will do better. Early sunlight streamed through the mansion's large glass windows, laying warm golden bands across the floor. It was a morning like any other, ordinary in every way, except for one thing. Alexander Russo wasn't going to work. For the first time in many years, he didn't wake at 5 o'clock to prepare for meetings, jobs, schemes, deals. Instead, he came down to the kitchen at 7 o'clock, still in lounge clothes instead of his usual 3-piece suit. Grace stood at the stove, making breakfast. When she heard footsteps, she turned and nearly dropped the pan in her hands. "Mr. Russo," she blurted, eyes wide with surprise. I didn't expect you to be here. I mean, at this hour. She stammered, not knowing what to say. Alexander lifted a hand, signaling her to steady herself. "It's fine, Grace," he said, his voice far gentler than it had been the night before. "I'll have breakfast with Lucas today. Can you call him down?" Grace stood there a moment, as if she couldn't believe what she'd heard. Then she nodded quickly. "Of course, sir. Right away." She hurried up the stairs, and a few minutes later the clack of crutches echoed down. Lucas appeared at the top of the staircase, still drowsy. But when the boy looked down and saw his father sitting at the breakfast table, those blue eyes widened like marbles. "Daddy?" Lucas asked, his voice full of suspicion, as if he were seeing a ghost. "You're still here?" Alexander felt a sharp ache in his chest at that question. His son was surprised to see his father at home in the morning. That was normal to him. That was all Lucas knew. "I thought we could eat together," Alexander said, trying to keep his voice even. "Is that okay?" Lucas's face lit up like the sun rising. The boy hurried down the stairs on his crutches, so fast he nearly tripped. Grace followed close behind, ready to catch him if she needed to. "Daddy's having breakfast with me," Lucas shouted as he climbed into his chair. "Aunt Grace, did you hear? Daddy's having breakfast with me?" And then, throughout the meal, Lucas talked without stopping. He told them about a turtle he'd seen in the garden yesterday, about the book Aunt Grace had read to him, about the dream he'd had last night, where he could run as fast as a superhero, about the exercises he was doing, and how one day he wanted to kick a soccer ball. Alexander listened to every word, and he realized this was the first time he'd truly listened to his son speak. "What's all this noise so early in the morning?" Victoria's voice cut in, cold and irritated. She stood in the kitchen doorway, still wearing a silk robe, her blonde hair messy, her eyes narrowed against the light, clearly nursing a headache after a night of partying. "Mommy," Lucas called, but Victoria only glanced at him. "I'm going to the spa," she said to Alexander, not bothering to explain. "Don't wait for me for dinner." And she left, her high heels clicking against the floor, without a goodbye kiss for her son, without a single backward look. Lucas watched her go, his expression dimming just a little. But then he turned back and kept talking to his father about a squirrel he'd named Mr. Fluffy. After breakfast, Alexander stood by the window of his study, looking out over the back garden. Grace and Lucas were out there. The young woman knelt in the grass, both hands lightly steadying Lucas at the hips, while the boy tried to balance without his crutches. "One more step, little warrior. You can do it," Grace's voice carried up, full of encouragement. Lucas trembled, his face flushed with effort. But he took one more step, then another. "I did it! Aunt Grace, I did it!" Alexander watched the scene and realized Grace wasn't improvising. Every movement she made was precise, professional, as if she'd been properly trained. He pulled out his phone and called the family's private doctor. "Dr. Patterson, I need to ask you something about Lucas," he said when the doctor picked up. "How has he been progressing?" He heard papers flipping on the other end. "Actually, Mr. Russo, I was going to call you about this," the doctor said, sounding surprised. "Lucas has improved significantly in the last 8 months. His muscle strength has increased by about 40%. His balance and coordination have improved dramatically. I don't know what you've been doing differently, but whatever it is, keep doing it." Alexander thanked the doctor and ended the call. He looked out at the garden again, where Grace was hugging Lucas in celebration after he managed to take 5 consecutive steps. 40% in 8 months. The most expensive doctors he'd hired in 4 years hadn't done that. But a housekeeper, with exercises learned from hospitals and videos online, had. Alexander had made his decision. He knew what he had to do. That afternoon, when Lucas had gone down for his nap and the mansion had fallen into quiet, Alexander called Grace into his study. She walked the long hallway, her heart pounding hard in her chest. "This is it," she thought. "This is when I'm fired." Mr. Russo had had a whole night to think. and now he was going to throw her out for stepping beyond the limits of a housekeeper. She'd braced herself for it since last night. She'd already been thinking where she'd find a new job, how she'd pay rent this month, how she'd take care of her mother and Daniel. But even with all that preparation, fear still gripped her. This job paid well, and more than that, she was going to miss Lucas. She was going to miss her little warrior more than she'd expected. Grace knocked, then stepped inside. Alexander's study was enormous and luxurious, with bookshelves rising all the way to the ceiling, a costly oak desk, and paintings she was certain each one was worth a full year of her wages. Alexander sat behind the desk, his face giving nothing away. He motioned for her to sit in the chair across from him. Grace sat, hands clasped tightly together on her lap, fighting to control the trembling. "Grace," Alexander said, his voice low and even. "I've made a decision." Grace held her breath. Here it comes. This was the moment she'd hear the words she dreaded. "You're fired. Pack your things. Leave by tonight." But what Alexander said next froze her in place. "I want to pay for you to finish your degree in physical therapy," he said, looking straight into her eyes. "Full tuition, books, everything you need. And I'm doubling your salary starting this month." Grace sat there, unable to believe what she'd heard. She was sure she'd misheard him. Or it was a joke. Or she was dreaming. "I'm sorry, what?" she asked, her voice strangled. Alexander repeated himself, slower this time. "I will pay for your education, and I'm raising your salary, double what you're making now." Grace sprang to her feet, the chair scraping back behind her. "Mr. Russo, I can't accept that," she said, shaking her head hard. "It's too much. It's way too much." Alexander lifted an eyebrow. "Why not?" "Because it's charity," Grace said, her voice shaking but firm with determination. "And I have my pride, sir. I don't want to owe anyone anything. I've worked hard my whole life not to owe anyone anything." She paused, swallowing hard. "I appreciate your offer, Mr. Russo. I really do. But I can't accept it." Alexander was silent for a moment, watching the young woman standing before him. She'd just refused an offer most people would have leapt at with joy. Not because she didn't need it, but because her self-respect wouldn't allow it. He stood, came out from behind the desk, and walked toward Grace. She took a small step back, but he stopped at a respectful distance. "This isn't charity, Grace," he said, his voice gentler now. "It's an investment." Grace looked at him, confused. "An investment?" Alexander nodded. "You've helped my son more in 8 months than all the expensive doctors I hired in 4 years. Lucas has improved 40%. He's smiling again. He believes he can walk. You did that, Grace. Not the doctors with their fancy degrees. You." She stood there, not knowing what to say. "You help Lucas walk," Alexander went on. "And I help you help hundreds of children walk in the future. You finish your degree, you become a licensed physical therapist, and you can help so many more kids like Lucas. Like your brother Daniel." He paused, meeting her eyes. "It's a fair deal. Grace, you're not owing me anything. You're earning it." Tears began to roll down Grace's cheeks. She tried to hold them back, but she couldn't. All the years of struggle, the dreams put on a shelf, the hopes she'd thought were dead, were waking up inside her. "Mr. Russo," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Do you know what my dream is?" Alexander shook his head, waiting. "I want to open a rehabilitation center," Grace said, tears still falling, but her eyes bright now. "A free center for children like Daniel, children whose families can't afford expensive treatments, children who are told they'll never walk, never run, never play like other kids." She wiped at her tears, but they kept coming. "I want to give them hope, Mr. Russo. I want to show them they can do anything if they don't give up, just like I've been showing Lucas." Alexander looked at her, and something inside him shifted. This young woman didn't dream of money, wealth, luxury. She dreamed of helping others. She dreamed of changing the lives of children she hadn't even met. "Then let me help you make that dream come true," he said, his voice steady with certainty. Grace looked at him, hesitation still in her eyes. Then she drew a deep breath, as if bracing for the most important decision of her life. "Okay," she said, nodding. "I'll accept your offer. But on one condition." Alexander raised an eyebrow. "What condition?" "I'll pay back every cent," Grace said, her voice full of resolve. "When I graduate, when I get a real job, I'll pay back everything. The tuition, the books, everything." She met his gaze without blinking. "This is a loan, Mr. Russo, not a gift." Alexander studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "Deal." They shook hands. And Grace didn't know that in Alexander's heart, he'd already decided he would never take a single cent back. This wasn't a loan. It was the very least he could do for the person who'd brought his son's smile back. 3 months passed like a beautiful dream. The mansion on the Upper East Side, once cold and hushed like a lavish museum, was now filled with laughter and life. Alexander started coming home earlier each day. At first it was 6 o'clock in the evening instead of 10 at night, then 5, then 4:30. Meetings were cut short. Jobs were handed off to subordinates. Nights in Brooklyn or Manhattan replaced by evenings at home with his son. Every night, Alexander sat beside Lucas's bed and read to him. They read about brave dragons, steadfast knights, warriors who never gave up. Lucas loved best the stories of heroes who pushed through hardship, and Alexander understood why. Sometimes they played chess, even though Lucas still didn't understand all the rules and often moved pieces at random. Alexander never minded. He only loved watching his son laugh when he managed to capture one of his father's pieces. Grace still worked during the day and began attending classes at night. Alexander arranged a private car to take her back and forth, even though she refused at first, saying it was too extravagant. "It's not luxury, it's practicality," he said. "You can't help Lucas if you're exhausted from taking the subway at midnight." Grace couldn't argue with that. And Lucas, their little warrior, improved day by day. In the first month, he could stand for 10 minutes without crutches, his legs trembling but not buckling. In the second month, he managed 5 short steps, each step a victory celebrated with cheers and hugs. In the third month, he walked halfway around the garden, Grace on one side, Alexander on the other, both ready to catch him if he fell. Every afternoon, the back garden became their training ground. Lucas called them Team Warrior, and the name stuck. "Team Warrior, ready," he would shout before every session, and Grace and Alexander would answer, "Ready." Those were moments Alexander had never thought he'd have. Moments so simple, so ordinary, yet more precious than any $1,000,000 job. Lucas laughed more, talked more, grew more confident. He no longer sat by the window staring out at the park with that sad look. Now he believed that one day he'd run in that park, and Victoria was more absent than ever. Spa today, shopping tomorrow, a trip to Miami next week, Paris next month. She came and went like an expensive ghost, rarely staying long enough to ask after her son or her husband. And strangely, no one in the house truly missed her when she was gone. One evening, after Team Warrior finished their most successful training session yet, when Lucas walked almost an entire lap around the garden, Alexander carried his son to bed. The boy was exhausted, but he still tried to keep his eyes open. "Daddy," Lucas murmured, drowsy. "Yes, little warrior. Can Aunt Grace stay with us forever?" The question made Alexander stop. "Why do you ask?" Lucas smiled, his blue eyes shining in the soft night light. "Because when she's here, you smile, Daddy. You smile a lot, and when you smile, I'm happy." Alexander didn't know what to say. He bent down, kissed his son's forehead, and pulled the blanket up. "Go to sleep, little warrior," he whispered. "We've got another big day tomorrow." Lucas nodded, hugged his pillow tight, and closed his eyes. Within seconds, he was asleep. Alexander stood there a long time, watching his son sleep. Lucas's question kept echoing in his mind. Can Aunt Grace stay with us forever? He hadn't answered it. But deep inside, in a place he didn't dare admit, Alexander already knew the answer. He wanted Grace to stay too. Forever. Victoria came back from a 2-week trip to Miami with her friends. She stepped out of the taxi with sun-kissed skin, freshly done hair, and a handbag stuffed with designer shopping. She pushed open the door and walked into the mansion, expecting the familiar quiet, the way it always was. But instead, she heard laughter, a child's laughter ringing through the house. Victoria stopped cold in the hallway, frowning, and then she saw something she couldn't believe. Alexander was home, at 6 o'clock in the evening. Her husband, the man she'd grown used to not seeing before 10 o'clock at night, was in the living room, and he was laughing. "Come on, Lucas. You can do it. 3 more steps." Alexander's voice carried from the back garden. Victoria walked to the window and looked outside. The sight in front of her froze her in place. Alexander was kneeling on the grass, arms open wide, waiting for Lucas, and Grace, the housekeeper, stood behind the boy, gently supporting his back. Lucas took trembling steps toward his father, and when he reached him, Alexander wrapped him in a tight hug, lifted him up, and spun him around in a circle. "You did it, little warrior. You did it." The laughter of all 3 of them rose together, blending into one. Victoria stood there watching, and something cold spread through her. In the days that followed, Victoria didn't go anywhere. She stayed home and watched. And what she saw made the suspicion inside her grow larger and larger. She saw Alexander coming home early every day, something he'd never done through all 5 years of their marriage. She saw him eating breakfast with Lucas, reading to him, playing with him in the garden, the very things she'd begged him to do in the early years, when he was always too busy. She saw Alexander calling Grace by her name, not the maid or the housekeeper, the way he'd spoken about the help before. She saw him smiling at Grace, smiles she'd never once seen him give her. One afternoon, as the air began to turn cold, Victoria stood behind a curtain and looked out at the garden. Grace was sitting on a bench, watching Lucas practice walking with Alexander. The young woman wore a thin shirt, and when a gust of wind swept through, she shivered. Alexander noticed immediately. He took off his jacket, walked over, and draped it over Grace's shoulders. The young woman looked up at him, startled, and Alexander said something Victoria couldn't hear, but she saw Grace smile and nod in thanks. Victoria clenched her fist so tightly her nails dug into her palm. That evening, before bed, Lucas hugged Grace and said loudly, "I love you, Aunt Grace. See you tomorrow." And Grace hugged him back and kissed his forehead. "I love you too, little warrior. Sweet dreams." Victoria watched from the stairs, and it felt like someone had just driven a knife into her chest. That night, Victoria stormed into the master bedroom, where Alexander sat reading documents. She slammed the door so hard he looked up. "Are you sleeping with the maid?" she demanded, her voice trembling with rage. Alexander set the papers down and looked at his wife with a calm so infuriating it made her skin prickle. "Don't be ridiculous, Victoria." "Ridiculous?" Victoria stepped closer, her eyes blazing like they might catch fire. "Then explain to me why you suddenly care about Lucas. You've never cared before. In 4 years, you've never once read him a bedtime story. You've never once come home early for him. And now suddenly you're father of the year?" Alexander rose and faced her. "Maybe I finally opened my eyes." "Opened your eyes?" Victoria gave a harsh laugh, bitter as poison. "No, this is because of her, isn't it? That pathetic little maid. She did something to you." Alexander felt anger begin to boil, but he held it down. "Grace has done more for our son in 8 months than you've done in 4 years, he said, his voice cold as ice. "She taught him to walk. She made him smile. She gave him hope." "What have you done, Victoria, besides shopping and going to spas?" The slap came fast and hard. Alexander's head turned with the force of it, but he didn't react, didn't lift a hand to his cheek, didn't show pain. He only turned back slowly to look at her. Victoria was breathing hard, her eyes red and wild. "How dare you!" she screamed, and then she started throwing things. A pillow flew across the room. A book slammed into the wall. A nightlamp shattered on the floor. "I'm your wife, the mother of your child, and you dare compare me to a maid? A nobody?" Alexander stood there and let her rage burn itself out. When Victoria finally ran out of things to throw and collapsed onto the bed, sobbing, he spoke at last. "I haven't touched her, Victoria," he said evenly. "Not once. But maybe you should ask yourself something." He stepped closer and looked down at the woman crying. "When was the last time you touched your own son? When was the last time you hugged him? Kissed him goodnight? Asked him how his day was?" Victoria didn't answer. She only cried, ragged sobs filling the room. Then, suddenly, the crying stopped. Victoria lifted her head and wiped her tears with the back of her hand, and when she looked at Alexander, there was no pain, no regret, only coldness, only calculation. "I want her out of this house by tomorrow," Victoria said, her voice like ice. "Either she goes, or I'll make your life a living hell." She stood and moved close enough to be in his face. "I know things about your business, Alex. The things you do, the people you deal with. Don't think for a second I haven't been paying attention all these years." She smiled, a poisonous smile. "So here's what's going to happen. That maid leaves tomorrow, or I start talking. And trust me, darling, you don't want me to start talking." Victoria turned and walked out, leaving Alexander standing alone in the middle of the wreckage. Late that night, Grace couldn't sleep. She lay on her bed in the small room set aside for the help, turning over and over with a storm of tangled thoughts. She knew something was wrong. Victoria had been looking at her with hatred for days, and the air in the house had grown so tight it was hard to breathe. Around midnight, Grace decided to go downstairs for a glass of water. She moved quietly along the hallway, not wanting to wake anyone. But as she passed the master bedroom, she heard shouting. Victoria's voice cut through the dark, shrill and full of fury. Grace knew she shouldn't eavesdrop, but her feet felt nailed to the floor. That woman is ruining our family, Victoria screamed. She's turning you against me. She's turning Lucas against me. Victoria, calm down, Alexander's voice came, tired. No, I will not calm down, Victoria shouted. I want her gone. Do you hear me? Gone. Something shattered, like glass thrown against a wall. If you don't fire her tomorrow, I'll tell everyone about your dirty business, Alex. Every single thing. The deals, the people, everything. I'll go to the police. I'll go to the press. I'll destroy you. Grace lifted a hand to cover her mouth, fighting to keep her breathing quiet. She knew about Alexander's work. Not the details, but she'd seen enough. The secret calls in the middle of the night, men dressed in black coming to meet him, thick envelopes being handed over. She knew her employer wasn't an ordinary businessman, and she knew that if Victoria spoke, everything would collapse. And I'll take Lucas away from you, Victoria went on, her voice venomous. I'll fight for custody. I'll tell the judge what kind of man you really are. You'll never see him again. Silence followed, heavy and suffocating. Grace didn't wait to hear more. She turned and hurried back to her room, closing the door and leaning against it, her heart pounding as if it might burst. This was her fault. All of it was her fault. If she hadn't shown up, if she hadn't spent time with Lucas, if she hadn't changed Alexander, none of this would be happening. She'd accidentally broken a family, and now Lucas could lose his father because of her. Tears fell onto the paper as she formed each word, her heart heavy with the weight of a final goodbye. She poured her soul into the lines, weaving together her gratitude for the chance she was given and her deepest prayers for Lucas's future. She hoped that by leaving, she could protect the family she had grown to love more than her own. The next morning, before the sun rose, Alexander left to handle something urgent. Grace knew it was her only chance. She placed the letter on his desk, then went back to her room to pack. She didn't have much. A few sets of clothes, a few books, and the bracelet Lucas had given her on her birthday last month. A cheap plastic band with a star on it, but the most precious thing she owned. Tears streamed down her face as she folded each item. But she didn't stop. She had to go. For Lucas. For Alexander. For this family. Aunt Grace? The small voice froze her in place. She turned and saw Lucas standing in her doorway, still sleepy, hair sticking up, clutching a worn old teddy bear. Why are you packing? The boy asked, his voice full of confusion. Grace wiped her tears quickly, trying to force a smile, but the smile shook, thin and fragile. Aunt Grace has to go away for a while, sweetheart, she said, her voice catching. Lucas stepped into the room, his crutches tapping softly on the floor. Go away? Where? For how long? The questions came one after another, and each one felt like a knife in Grace's heart. She didn't know how to answer. I don't know, Lucas, she whispered. She knelt to his level and took his small hands in hers. But I need you to be strong, okay? You're a warrior, remember? You're the bravest little warrior I know. Lucas looked at her, his blue eyes starting to fill. But we're Team Warrior, he said, his voice trembling. Team Warrior is you, me, and Daddy. You can't leave the team. Lucas. No! The boy burst into tears, big round drops rolling down his cheeks. Please don't leave me, Aunt Grace. You promised. You promised we're a team. Grace pulled him into her arms, and she couldn't hold back anymore. Her own tears poured out, soaking into Lucas's soft hair. I'm sorry, little warrior. I'm so sorry, she sobbed. Lucas clung to her as if he were afraid that if he let go, she'd disappear. You're the only one who believes in me, Aunt Grace, he whispered between sobs. The only one. Please, please don't go. Grace's heart shattered. She held him tighter, kissing his forehead, his hair, his tear-soaked cheeks. I'll always believe in you, Lucas, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Always. No matter where I am, no matter what happens. You are my little warrior, and you always will be. Grace decided to leave at midnight, when the whole house had fallen asleep. She couldn't bear looking into Lucas's eyes one more time and saying goodbye. She wasn't strong enough for that. After Lucas cried until he was exhausted and fell asleep in her arms that afternoon, Grace gently laid him in bed and promised she'd be there when he woke up. It was a lie, the first and only lie she'd ever told her little warrior. Now, in the dark of her room, Grace sat down and wrote another letter. Not the resignation she'd left on Alexander's desk, but a letter for Lucas. Her hands trembled, tears dripping onto the page and blurring a few words. But she kept writing, one letter at a time, pouring every ounce of her love into it. My little warrior, she began. By the time you read this, I'll be gone. But I need you to remember something, okay? You're stronger than you know. You're braver than you believe. All those steps you've taken, all those times you fell and got back up, that's not because of me. That's because of you. You have a warrior's heart, Lucas. Never forget that. She paused, wiped her tears, and kept writing. Never give up. Never stop walking. One day, you're going to run. I know you will. And wherever I am, I'll be cheering for you. I'll be so proud of you. I love you, little warrior. More than you'll ever know. Your Aunt Grace. Grace folded the letter, then looked down at the bracelet on her wrist, the one Lucas had given her, with a little plastic star. She took it off and set it on top of the letter. Lucas needed it more than she did. He needed something to remind him that Aunt Grace would always believe in him. Grace slipped into Lucas's room, her footsteps so light they seemed to have no weight. The boy was sleeping deeply. Brown hair spread across his pillow, lips parted, one hand still clenched around his worn old teddy bear. He looked so peaceful, so innocent, with no idea that his world was about to collapse again. Grace placed the letter and the bracelet on the pillow right beside his face. She stood there a long time, watching him sleep, carving the image into her memory. This might be the last time she ever saw him. "Goodbye, my little warrior," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I love you." Then she bent down and kissed Lucas lightly on the forehead. The boy shifted, but didn't wake. Grace turned and walked out of the room, not daring to look back even once. She picked up her small bag with a few sets of clothes and went down the stairs, each step heavy as lead. At the back door, she stopped and looked at the mansion one last time. Over the past 11 months, this place had become her home. Not because of the luxury or the comfort, but because of Lucas, because of his laughter, because of those afternoons practicing in the garden, because of Team Warrior. This was where she'd lived the happiest months of her life. And now she had to leave. Grace called a taxi on her phone, then stepped outside. The October night was cold enough to cut into skin, but she didn't feel it. She only felt empty. When the taxi arrived, Grace slid into the back seat and gave the address of her apartment in the South Bronx. The car pulled away, and she watched through the window as the mansion grew smaller and smaller, then vanished into the darkness. 2 hours later, Alexander came home. The emergency meeting with his partners had dragged on longer than expected, and he was so tired he only wanted to collapse into bed. But habit made him step into his study first, to check whether anything needed handling. That was when he saw it. A white envelope lay on his desk, his name written in careful handwriting. He recognized Grace's hand immediately. Alexander picked up the envelope and opened it. He read line by line, his face growing paler as he reached the heart of her plea. "Please take care of Lucas. He needs you more than he needs me. Don't give up on him. Keep doing the exercises. Keep reading him stories. Keep being there for him. He's going to walk one day, Mr. Russo. I know it. He has a warrior's heart. Sincerely, Grace Mitchell." Beneath it, there was an extra line, as if she'd hesitated before writing it. P.S. Please don't look for me. This is for the best. For Lucas. For you. For everyone. Alexander stood motionless, the letter trembling in his hands. His chest felt like someone was squeezing it shut, and every breath hurt. She was gone. Grace was gone. And then, a scream tore through the night from upstairs. "Daddy! Daddy!" Lucas's voice was frantic, desperate. "Aunt Grace is gone. Daddy! She's gone!" Alexander ran up the stairs, his heart pounding like it might burst. Lucas's crying echoed down the hallway, tearing through the quiet of the night. He shoved open his son's door, and what he saw hit him like a fist, straight to the chest. Lucas was sitting on the bed, shaking, tears streaming down his cheeks. In the boy's hands was the bracelet with the little star charm, the one Grace had left behind. He clutched it as if it were the only thing of her he had left. Grace's letter lay crumpled on the bed, the creases showing Lucas had tried to read it again and again, even though he was only 4 and couldn't understand every word. But he understood enough. He understood that Aunt Grace was gone. "Daddy." Lucas looked up when he saw his father, blue eyes swollen and red from crying. "She left me. Aunt Grace left me." Alexander stepped closer and sat on the edge of the bed. He didn't know what to say. Every comfort he could think of sounded hollow, meaningless. "She promised." "Daddy," Lucas sobbed. "She promised we're a team. Team Warrior. You, me, and Aunt Grace. Why did she leave? Did I do something wrong? Did I not try hard enough?" "No, Lucas," Alexander said, his voice catching. "You didn't do anything wrong. This isn't your fault." "Then why?" the boy asked, staring up at him with desperate eyes. searching for an answer Alexander didn't have. Why did she leave me? Alexander pulled his son into his arms, feeling that small body trembling against him. He had no answer. He didn't know how to explain to a 4-year-old that adults sometimes do cruel things, that the world isn't always fair, that the people you love sometimes have to leave for reasons you may never understand. It's for the best, Lucas. Victoria's voice came from the doorway. Alexander turned and saw his wife standing there in her silk robe, arms folded across her chest, and on her lips was a smile. A satisfied smile she didn't bother to hide. She was just a maid. Victoria went on, her voice light, as if she were talking about the weather. Maids come and go. You'll forget about her in a few days. Lucas looked at his mother, and in those child's eyes, Alexander saw something change. Sadness hardening into anger, despair turning into hate. She's not just a maid, Lucas screamed, his voice breaking as he cried and shouted at the same time. She's my Aunt Grace. She's my best friend. And I hate you. I hate you. Victoria took a step back, shocked by her son's reaction. Lucas, don't talk to Mommy like that. You made her leave, the boy kept screaming. I know it was you. I hate you. I hate you. Alexander stood up and put himself between them. Victoria, leave, he said, his voice cold. Now. Victoria opened her mouth as if to argue, but when she looked into her husband's eyes, she chose not to. She turned and walked away, her heels tapping sharply against the wooden floor. The days that followed were hell. Lucas fell apart completely. He refused to eat, only drinking a few sips of milk when Alexander begged him. He refused to practice walking, threw his purple crutches into a corner of the room and never touched them again. He refused to speak to anyone, even his father. He only lay on the bed, curled into a small ball, holding the bracelet with the star and staring into empty space. On the second day, Alexander called the private doctor to examine him. Doctor. Patterson checked Lucas carefully, then pulled Alexander into the hallway. Mr. Russo, he said gravely. His mental state is severely affecting his physical recovery. The muscles he's built over the past months are starting to weaken because he refuses to use them. If this continues, he could lose all the progress he's made. Alexander felt as if a knife had been driven into his heart. What can I do? He asked. The doctor shook his head. I can prescribe medication for anxiety, but at his age, I'd rather not. What he needs is emotional support. He needs the person he's attached to. She's gone, Alexander said, his voice dropping. Then find her, the doctor said bluntly, or find a way to help him move on. But whatever you do it fast. He's a strong kid, Mr. Russo, but even warriors have their limits. Victoria tried to reach Lucas a few times, maybe out of guilt, or maybe only to prove to Alexander that she could replace Grace. But every time she entered the room, Lucas shrank away and turned his face to the wall. Don't touch me, he screamed when Victoria tried to stroke his hair. You made her leave. I don't want you. I want Aunt Grace. On the third day, Alexander sat beside his son's bed, watching the boy curled up, his eyes empty as he stared at the bracelet in his hand. The room was so quiet it felt hard to breathe. Daddy? Lucas spoke, his voice hoarse from crying too much. Yes, little warrior. Aunt Grace said I'm a warrior, the boy whispered, tears starting again. But warriors don't cry, right? Warriors are supposed to be strong. Alexander felt his heart break. Warriors cry too, son, he said, his voice thick. The bravest warriors cry the most, because they feel things deeply, because they love deeply. Lucas turned to look at him, eyes red and wet. I'm sorry I can't stop crying, Daddy. I'm sorry I'm not strong. I'm sorry I'm not a real warrior. Alexander pulled his son into his arms, holding him tight as if he feared that if he let go, the boy would vanish. And for the first time in front of his child, he let his own tears fall. You are the strongest person I know, Lucas, he whispered into his son's ear. You are my warrior, and Daddy's going to fix this. I promise you. I promise. Lucas didn't speak. He only clung to his father, the small sobs fading, until he was exhausted and fell asleep in Alexander's arms. Alexander gently laid him back on the bed and pulled the blanket up. He stood there for a moment, looking down at his son, the little warrior who'd fought for so long and finally collapsed. Then he walked out and closed the door. His eyes were ice. He pulled out his phone and called Marcus, his head of security. Marcus, he said, his voice stripped of emotion. Find Grace Mitchell. Find her now. I don't care what it takes. I don't care how much it costs. Turn this city upside down if you have to. But find her. Marcus and his team turned all of New York City upside down to find Grace. They checked every address in her employee file, every acquaintance she'd ever mentioned, every place a young woman with very little money might go. 3 days passed like 3 years for Alexander. Every hour without news was another hour watching Lucas wither. The boy still refused to eat, refused to talk, only lying there with the bracelet in his hands, whispering Aunt Grace's name in his sleep. Finally, late in the afternoon on the 3rd day, Marcus called. "Boss, we found her," his voice said through the phone. Alexander tightened his grip on the steering wheel, his heart beating faster. "Where?" "South Bronx. A small apartment on East 149th Street. She's been staying with her mother and brother." Marcus paused before he continued. "Boss, the place is... it's not good. And from what my guys observed, she's working 3 jobs now. Waitressing at a diner during the day, cleaning offices at night, and taking care of an elderly neighbor in between." Something clenched hard in Alexander's chest. 3 jobs, in 3 days. She was grinding herself down. "I'll go alone," he said. "No backup needed." "Boss, South Bronx isn't exactly friendly territory for someone like you." "I said alone, Marcus." Alexander drove into the South Bronx as the sun began to set. This was a part of the city men like him never entered, at least not alone, and not without a weapon. Old buildings with peeling brickwork, rusted fire escapes, and watchful eyes following his luxury car. But Alexander didn't care. He was thinking of only one person. He found the apartment at the address Marcus gave him, on the 5th floor of a building with no elevator. He climbed the stairs step by step, past puddles of standing water and flaking walls, until he stood in front of door number 52, an old wooden door with peeling paint, a long crack running from top to bottom. And from inside, he heard singing, Grace's voice. She was singing a lullaby, soft and sad. He stood there a moment, listening. Her voice was tired, roughened by too little sleep, but still so gentle it made his chest ache. Alexander drew a deep breath, then knocked. The singing stopped. Light footsteps approached, then the door opened. Grace stood there, and Alexander felt as if someone had punched him in the chest. She was thinner, unmistakably thinner after only 3 days. Dark circles shadowed her brown eyes, proof she'd barely slept. Her hair was tied up in a hurry, loose strands falling against her cheeks. Her clothes were old and wrinkled, but to Alexander, she was still beautiful. Beautiful in a way he couldn't explain. Beautiful because of her resilience, because of her sacrifice, because of the heart that was too large for a body that seemed too small to hold it. Mr. Russo? Grace gasped, eyes wide with shock. What are you doing here? She glanced anxiously up and down the hallway, as if she were afraid someone might see him here. How did you find me? Alexander didn't answer right away. He looked past her into the apartment. The place was so cramped it felt suffocating. Only a single room serving as living room, bedroom, and kitchen all at once. The walls were damp with mold, patches of plaster fallen away to expose brick beneath. The window didn't seal, and cold air leaked in. On a narrow bed in the corner, an older woman lay with an oxygen tube in her nose. That had to be Mrs. Sarah Mitchell. And on a chair beside her, a young man sat with his legs in casts, his face pale with pain. Daniel, the brother Grace had spent her whole life caring for. Alexander looked back at Grace, and he understood. He understood why she was working 3 jobs. He understood why she'd grown gaunt in only 3 days. Her mother was sicker. Her brother needed surgery, and she, alone, was trying to carry it all. You shouldn't be here, Grace said, her voice trembling. Please, just go back. Forget about me. Alexander stepped forward, and Grace stepped back, but he didn't stop. He held her brown eyes, the eyes trying so hard not to meet his, and he spoke with a certainty that left no room for hesitation. I came to bring you home, Grace. Grace stood in the doorway, one hand gripping the frame as if it were the only thing holding her upright. You shouldn't be here, Mr. Russo, she said, her voice trembling. What if someone sees you? This neighborhood. People talk. If anyone from your world finds out you came here alone, I don't care, Alexander said, unwavering. Grace, let me in. She stood there for a moment, brown eyes full of conflict. Then, finally, she let out a slow breath and stepped aside to let him enter. Alexander walked into the apartment, and with every step, something inside him ached harder. The place was worse than what he'd seen from the doorway. The old wooden floor creaked under his feet. Water stains marred the ceiling, proof that pipes above were leaking. The air smelled of damp and mold, cold even though it wasn't winter outside. This was where Grace had lived before she came to work for him. This was where she'd returned after leaving the luxury of the Upper East Side. Daniel, the 17-year-old Grace had told him about, tried to rise from the chair beside their mother's bed. His casted legs trembled, his face tightening with pain, but he still forced himself upright to be polite. "You must be Mr. Russo," Daniel said, courteous, even as he was clearly enduring the pain. "Grace has told us about you, and about Lucas." "Daniel, sit down," Grace said quickly, easing her brother back into the chair. "You're not supposed to stand." From the bed, Mrs. Sarah Mitchell, the woman Alexander had glimpsed over Grace's shoulder, tried to sit up. She was so thin, her nightgown seemed to swallow her whole, the oxygen tube still in her nose, yet there was warmth in her smile. "So you're Mr. Russo," she said, her voice weak but gentle. "Grace has told us so much about Lucas. She talks about him all the time, about how brave he is, about how hard he tries. She loves that little boy like he's her own." Alexander looked at the sick woman, then at the young man with his legs in casts, then at Grace standing between them, shoulders drawn tight under the weight of an entire family. And he understood. He understood why she was so strong. Because she'd never had the luxury of any other choice. "Can we talk?" Alexander asked Grace. "Outside?" Grace hesitated, then nodded. She followed him into the hallway and closed the apartment door behind her. The corridor was dark and cold, with only a flickering bulb at the far end. "Why did you leave without saying goodbye?" Alexander asked, turning to face her. Grace lowered her head, unable to look at him. "Because if I looked at Lucas one more time, I wouldn't have been able to go," she whispered. "I heard Mrs. Victoria that night. The things she said, the threats she made. I couldn't let her destroy everything because of me. I couldn't let Lucas lose his father because of me." "So you just left?" Alexander asked, and there was something in his voice that sounded like reproach, but it was threaded with pain. "Without a word? Without letting me fight for you?" "I didn't want to cause trouble for your family," Grace said, her voice thick. I thought if I disappeared, everything would go back to normal. Lucas would forget about me. You would forget about me. And your family would be okay." Alexander stepped closer. "Lucas hasn't eaten in 3 days, Grace," he said, each word cutting like a blade. "He won't talk. He won't walk. He threw away his crutches. He just lies in bed, holding that bracelet you gave him, crying and calling your name." Grace lifted her head, brown eyes flooding. "What?" "He thinks you abandoned him," Alexander went on, his voice trembling faintly. "He thinks he did something wrong. He keeps asking me why his Aunt Grace left. And I don't know what to tell him, Grace. I don't know how to fix this." Tears started rolling down Grace's cheeks. "I'm so sorry," she sobbed. "I didn't mean to hurt him. I never wanted to hurt him. I thought I was doing the right thing." "Then come back," Alexander said. Grace shook her head hard, tears flying. "I can't. Mrs. Victoria and I are getting a divorce." The words froze, Grace in place. She stared at him, eyes wide, unable to believe what she'd heard. "What?" "I've made my choice," Alexander said, steady. "I should have made it years ago, but I was too blind, too busy, too focused on the wrong things. Victoria hasn't been a wife to me for a long time. She certainly hasn't been a mother to Lucas, and when she threatened you, when she forced you to leave, she crossed a line I can never forgive." He moved closer until he was right in front of Grace. She could feel the warmth of him in the cold hallway air. "I'm sorry I let you go," he said, softer now, almost a whisper. "I'm sorry I didn't fight for you when she threatened you. That was my mistake, my biggest mistake." He took her hand, and Grace didn't pull away. Her hand was ice cold, small inside his warm grip. "Lucas needs you, Grace," Alexander said, looking straight into her tear-soaked eyes. Then he paused, as if gathering all his courage for what came next. "And I need you too," Grace cried, tears streaming down her face. But in her eyes, Alexander saw something shifting, despair giving way to hope. "What about my family?" she asked, her voice breaking. "Daniel needs surgery. His condition is getting worse every day. The doctors said if he doesn't get the operation soon. And my mom, her heart. I can't leave them. I can't." Alexander tightened his hold on her hand, not letting her pull away. "I'll take care of everything," he said, certain as an oath. "Daniel will get the best surgeon in the country. Your mother will have the best cardiologist. I'll move them to a better place, somewhere clean and safe. I'll take care of everything, Grace. Everything." She looked at him, tears still falling, but a trembling smile began to form on her lips. "Why?" she asked. "Why are you doing all this? For me?" Alexander looked at her, and in his eyes Grace saw something she'd never seen before. Tenderness, sincerity, real, steady care. "Because you deserve it," he said. "Because Lucas needs you. Because I need you. Because you're the best thing that's happened to our family." He gave her hand a gentle squeeze. "Just come home, Grace. Please." Grace sat in Alexander's car, staring out the window as the streets of the South Bronx slowly gave way to the sleek high-rises of Manhattan. She still couldn't believe what had just happened. Only an hour ago, she'd been in that damp little apartment, worrying about next month's rent, about Daniel's surgery, about her mother's medication. And now she was on her way back to the Upper East Side mansion, riding in the luxury car of the most powerful mafia boss in New York. Alexander had arranged everything at a dizzying speed. The moment Grace nodded yes, he'd started making call after call. A new apartment for Mrs. Mitchell and Daniel in Manhattan, clean and fully furnished, only a 10-minute walk from Mount Sinai Hospital. A surgery date for Daniel with the best orthopedic surgeon in the city, scheduled for next week. Comprehensive health insurance for all three of them, the kind of coverage Grace wouldn't have dared to dream of. All of it done in just a few phone calls. "Mr. Russo, this is too much," Grace said, her voice still thick with emotion. "I can't accept all of this. The apartment, the surgery, the insurance. It's too much. I can't possibly—" "You can," Alexander cut in, gentle but firm. "And you will. But consider it an advance payment," he said, eyes still fixed on the road ahead, "for being Lucas's full-time rehabilitation specialist." Grace looked at him, confused. "Full-time rehabilitation specialist? That's not a real job title." Alexander turned his head toward her, and for the first time since she'd met him, she saw him smile, a real smile, not something polite or practiced, but warm enough to soften the hard lines of his face. "It is now," he said. "I just created it. Congratulations on your new position, Miss Mitchell. Benefits include full medical coverage for your family, a salary that'll make your current 3 jobs combined look like pocket change, and most importantly, unlimited access to the world's bravest little warrior." Grace didn't know whether to laugh or cry. She did both. The car stopped at the gate of the Upper East Side mansion, and Grace felt her heart pounding hard in her chest. 3 days ago, she'd left this place in the dark, believing she'd never return. And now she was here, about to step through that gate again. Alexander got out first and came around to open her door. Grace stepped down, her legs slightly unsteady. She looked up at the mansion, the familiar windows, the garden where Team Warrior had spent so many afternoons training. And then she saw him. Lucas was sitting on the front steps, curled in on himself like a little bird. He was thinner, paler, his blue eyes hollowed from too little sleep and too many tears. In his hands was the star bracelet, the thing he'd clutched tight for 3 straight days. He was staring down at it, not realizing anyone was coming. Then, as if he sensed something, Lucas lifted his head. Those blue eyes widened, wider still, as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing. "Aunt!" His voice trembled, as if he were afraid this was only a dream, and she'd disappear if he spoke too loudly. "Aunt Grace?" Grace dropped to her knees right there and opened her arms wide toward him. Tears were already sliding down her cheeks, but she smiled, the brightest smile she could manage. "I'm home, little warrior," she said, her voice breaking. "I'm home." And then Lucas sprang up. He didn't reach for his crutches. He didn't think about how he wasn't supposed to walk without them. He only knew Aunt Grace was right there, arms open, waiting for him, and he had to get to her. Lucas ran down the steps, wobbling, stumbling, nearly falling more times than he could count, but he didn't stop. He just ran and ran and ran, until he flew straight into Grace's arms and held on as if he were afraid she'd vanish. "You came back," Lucas sobbed, his whole body shaking in Grace's embrace. "I knew you'd come back. I knew it. I knew it. Aunt Grace, I knew you wouldn't leave me. I knew it." Grace held him tight, tears pouring down unchecked. "I'm sorry, little warrior," she whispered into his ear. "I'm so sorry I left. I'll never leave you again. Never. I promise." "You promise?" Lucas lifted his face, red-rimmed eyes searching hers with hope. "You really promise?" "I promise," Grace said, kissing his forehead. "Team Warrior forever, remember?" Lucas smiled, for the first time in 3 days, and clung to her even tighter. "Team Warrior forever," he echoed. All afternoon, Lucas didn't let go of Grace's hand for even a second. He followed her everywhere, holding on as if he feared that if he let go, she'd disappear again. Grace didn't mind. She let him hold her hand, let him sit in her lap while she read stories, let him hug her when sleepiness started to wash over him. Alexander watched from a distance, leaning against the doorframe, smiling. This was the sight he'd been desperate to see for 3 long days. Lucas was smiling. Grace was back. Everything would be all right. But his smile vanished the moment he heard an engine outside the gate. He looked toward the window, and his eyes went cold. A sleek black Mercedes was pulling up to the entrance. The door opened and Victoria stepped out, elegant and polished as ever in an expensive red dress. But she wasn't alone. A middle-aged man in a gray suit followed her, a leather briefcase in his hand, his face cold and calculating. Alexander recognized him immediately. Richard Hayes, one of the most expensive divorce lawyers in New York. Victoria walked into the house, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. She'd come ready for war, her expensive attorney at her side, her threats arranged neatly in her mind. But all that confidence dissolved the moment she stepped into the living room and saw Grace. Victoria's face went pale, her eyes widening in shock before snapping into anger. "What is she doing back in my house?" She snarled, pointing at Grace on the sofa with Lucas curled in her lap. Alexander came out of the study, calm as if he were greeting an ordinary guest. "It's not your house anymore, Victoria," he said, his voice cold. "And we need to talk." Victoria turned to her lawyer as if looking for support. Richard Hayes gave a small nod, and she gathered herself again. "Fine, let's talk," she said, lifting her chin. "I want a divorce, and I want half of everything. The houses, the cars, the accounts, everything." Alexander didn't look surprised. He just stood there with his arms folded, waiting. "And I want full custody of Lucas," Victoria went on, her voice sharpened with calculation. "A court will never give a child to a man like you, Alex. Not when I tell them what you really do for a living. Your business meetings in Brooklyn, your associates in dark suits. Is that so?" Alexander cut in, his tone still strangely even. He walked to his desk, opened a drawer, and pulled out a thick leather portfolio. "Before you continue, Victoria, I think you should take a look at this." He set it on the table, opened it, and slid it toward her. Victoria looked down, and all the color drained from her face. Inside were stacks of documents, photographs, and reports. 2 years, Alexander said, his voice empty of emotion. "You've been having an affair with your tennis instructor for 2 years. I have photos, hotel receipts, text messages, everything." Victoria stumbled back a step, her mouth opening, but no sound coming out. "And this," Alexander continued, flipping to another section, "is a complete record of every spa trip, every shopping spree, every vacation you've taken in the past 4 years. 347 days away from home in 4 years, Victoria. Almost a full year. Away from your son." His voice hardened when he said Lucas. "And this," he said, pulling out a medical file, "is documentation of your addiction to alcohol and sleeping pills. Prescriptions from 4 different doctors. The empty bottles the staff has found in your room. The nights you came home so drunk you couldn't remember your own name." Victoria stood there shaking, not a trace of pride left. Her attorney was silent too, his face showing he knew this fight was lost before it began. "You can try to destroy me, Victoria," Alexander said, stepping closer. "You can tell everyone about my business. But ask yourself this: who will believe you? A woman who abandoned her disabled child to go shopping? A woman who's been cheating on her husband for 2 years? A woman who's addicted to pills and alcohol?" He stopped right in front of her, eyes like ice. "You'll destroy yourself long before you can touch me." Victoria broke. She dropped into a chair, tears spilling down her cheeks, smearing her expensive mascara. "Alex, please," she sobbed. "Please, give me another chance. I can change. I can be a better wife, a better mother. I'll stop drinking. I'll end things with Marco. I'll stay home more. Please, Alex, don't do this to me." Alexander looked at the woman he'd once married and felt nothing but emptiness. No anger, no hatred, only emptiness. "Mommy?" That small voice made everyone in the room turn. Lucas stood at the living room doorway, holding Grace's hand tightly. He looked at his mother, and his blue eyes held no fear, no sadness, only the strange calm of a child who'd been forced to grow up too soon. Victoria lifted her head, and for the first time in 4 years, she truly looked into her son's eyes. "Lucas, baby, Mommy is so sorry," she began, desperation flooding her voice. "Mommy will do better. Mommy promises." "You never played with me, Mommy," Lucas cut in, his voice soft, but each word landing like a blade. "You never read me stories. You never watched me practice walking. You never believed I could walk." The boy tightened his grip on Grace's hand. "Aunt Grace did. She believes in me. She helps me every day. She makes Daddy smile." Lucas looked at his father, then at Grace, then back at his mother. "I want Aunt Grace to stay, Mommy. I want Daddy to smile. And I want to be happy." Victoria stared at her son, and in that moment she understood everything. She understood what she'd missed, the first steps she hadn't been there to see, the smiles she'd never noticed, the tears she'd never wiped away. She'd had everything, and she'd let it slip through her fingers for things that meant nothing. And now it was too late. An hour later, Victoria signed the divorce papers. She didn't demand custody. She didn't threaten to expose anything. She simply signed her name in silence, took the money Alexander offered, and stood. At the door, she paused as if she might look back one last time. But she didn't. Victoria walked out of the mansion, got into the waiting car, and disappeared from their lives without a single goodbye. 6 months had passed since the day Victoria left. 6 months in which the Upper East Side mansion was no longer a cold museum, but had become a real home. Grace officially became Lucas's full-time caregiver, with a salary she still believed was far too high and Alexander still believed was not high enough. She no longer slept in the small room meant for the help, but was moved into a spacious bedroom on the second floor, right next to Lucas's room. Daniel, her younger brother, went through a brilliantly successful surgery. The doctor said that with the right physical therapy, he could walk normally within 1 year. And now, 3 times a week, Daniel came to the same rehabilitation center as Lucas. 2 brothers, one 17 and one 4, became close friends, training together, encouraging each other, fighting together. Mrs. Sarah Mitchell was doing much better too. With the best medical care and a clean, airy new apartment, her heart disease was well controlled. She could even visit Lucas every weekend, cooking him dishes she called her secret grandmother recipes. Lucas adored her the way he would have adored his own grandmother. Grace kept going to school at night, and after 6 months of relentless work, she graduated with a degree in physical therapy, the top score in her class. On the day she received her diploma, Alexander and Lucas sat in the very front row, clapping louder than anyone in the entire auditorium. Lucas even brought a homemade sign with messy letters that read, "Go Aunt Grace," and Alexander took more photos than Grace could count. It was one of the happiest days of her life, and Lucas, their little warrior, had progressed so much no one could believe it. He could now walk without crutches for a full 30 minutes at a time. He'd even started running in small, unsteady, slow little bursts, but it was still running. And he laughed so much that sometimes Grace and Alexander would look at each other and smile along, because that laughter was too clear, too happy. Alexander was changing too. He began pulling back from the underground world, slowly handing off operations to people he trusted, and focusing on building legitimate businesses. He told Marcus he wanted Lucas to grow up without ever being ashamed of his father. He wanted to become someone his son could be proud of. And the relationship between Alexander and Grace had changed in a way they both felt but neither dared to say out loud. They were no longer employer and employee. They were teammates, friends, 2 people raising a special child together. But it was more than that. There were looks that lingered longer than they needed to when they met by accident in the hallway. There were accidental touches when they helped Lucas practice walking. There were smiles Alexander saved only for Grace, and moments when Grace blushed when she caught him watching her. They both knew what was happening, but neither of them dared to name it. One evening, after Team Warrior finished their training in the garden, and the 3 of them sat on the grass watching the sunset, Lucas suddenly spoke. "Daddy," he asked, his head resting on Grace's shoulder, "do you love Aunt Grace?" The question froze both Alexander and Grace in place. Grace felt her face burn, unable to look at Alexander. "Why do you ask?" Alexander asked, his voice surprisingly steady. Lucas lifted his head, clear blue eyes staring at his father with pure innocence. "Because you look at her the way princes look at princesses in my storybooks," he said. "You know, with the sparkly eyes and the big smile, like she's the most beautiful person in the whole world." Alexander didn't answer. He only looked at Grace, and for one brief moment their eyes met. Grace saw something in his gaze, something she didn't dare name, something she feared that if she believed in it, her heart would shatter if it wasn't real. Then the moment passed, and Alexander pulled Lucas into his arms and changed the subject by asking what he wanted for dinner. But that night, after the whole house had fallen asleep, Alexander sat alone in his study. He opened his desk drawer and took out a tiny red velvet box. Inside was a diamond ring, simple but sparkling, not too extravagant, but enough to say everything. He'd bought it 2 weeks earlier, but he still hadn't found the right moment, or maybe he still didn't have the courage. Alexander stared at the ring for a long time, then gently set it back in the desk drawer, and locked it carefully. Not yet, but soon. One weekend afternoon, as the golden sunlight began to fade and the sky turned a breathtaking shade of pink and orange, Alexander led Grace out into the back garden. She didn't know why he wanted to come out here, but she followed without asking. They stood in the middle of the lush green lawn, where every blade of grass seemed to hold a memory. This was where Lucas had taken his first steps without crutches. This was where Team Warrior had been born, with laughter and cheering every time the boy managed one more step. This was where everything began to change, where a cold mafia boss learned how to become a father, where a poor housekeeper found a family she'd never dared to dream of. "Grace," Alexander said, his voice gentler than usual. "Do you remember the first time we stood here together?" Grace looked around the garden as the memories rushed back. "You were watching me teach Lucas from the window," she said, smiling at the thought. "I thought you were angry. I was so scared that night. I thought you were going to fire me." Alexander shook his head. "I wasn't angry," he said, turning to look at her. "I was amazed. I'd never seen anyone care for Lucas like that. Not the doctors, not the therapists, certainly not." He didn't say Victoria's name, but Grace understood. "He's easy to love," she said softly. Alexander looked at her, and his eyes softened in the way she'd only ever seen when he looked at Lucas. "So are you," he said. Grace lifted her chin, her heart pounding so fast she was afraid he could hear it. She didn't know what to say. She just stood there, looking into the eyes of the man who'd changed her life. Alexander drew a deep breath, as if gathering every ounce of courage he had. "I'm not good with words, Grace," he said. "I've never been. I'm good at giving orders, at making deals, at intimidating people. But when it comes to saying what I feel," he stopped and shook his head. "But I know what I feel, and I can't keep it inside anymore." And then, to Grace's stunned disbelief, Alexander dropped to one knee. He, the most powerful mafia boss in New York, the man the whole city feared, was kneeling in front of her on the grass in his own garden. "You saved my son, Grace," he said, his voice catching. "You taught him to walk. You taught him to believe in himself. You gave him hope when everyone else had given up." He looked up at her, his eyes shining. "And you saved me. You made me see what I was missing. You made me want to be a better man, a better father, a better person." "Alexander," Grace whispered, tears beginning to slip down her cheeks. "You made this house a home," he went on. "For the first time in years, there's laughter here. There's love here. And it's all because of you." He pulled a small red velvet box from his pocket and opened it. Inside, the diamond ring caught the sunset and scattered light. "I don't want you to stay as Lucas's caregiver anymore," he said. Grace felt her heart stop. "What?" she gasped, panic rising. Was he sending her away after everything? But Alexander smiled, the warmest smile she'd ever seen on his face. "I want you to stay as my wife," he said, "as Lucas's mother, as my family. Grace Mitchell, will you marry me?" Before Grace could answer, a small voice burst out from behind the rose bushes. "Say yes, Aunt Grace. Please say yes." Lucas ran out, his face glowing. He'd helped his father hide the ring, and he'd been waiting here the whole afternoon. He ran to Grace, wrapped his arms around her leg, and looked up with blue eyes full of hope. "Please, Aunt Grace, I want you to be my mommy, my real mommy. Please say yes," Grace cried. She cried and laughed at the same time, tears streaming down her cheeks while her smile shone like the sun. She looked at Alexander kneeling in front of her, looked at Lucas clinging to her, and she knew the answer. She'd known it for a long time. "Yes," she said, her voice breaking. "Yes, 1,000 times yes." Alexander rose, his hands trembling slightly as he took the ring from the box and slid it onto Grace's ring finger. It fit perfectly, as if it had been made to live there. Then he pulled her into his arms, and Lucas hugged both of them, forming a small circle of love and happiness. "Team Warrior forever," Lucas shouted, and all three of them laughed, the sound echoing through the garden in the sunset glow. In the garden where a little warrior had learned to walk, a new family was born. 5 years later, the Upper East Side mansion was no longer the home of a mafia boss. It had become a real home, a place where children's laughter rang out every day, where love spread into every small corner. Lucas was 9 now, a healthy, energetic boy who could run and play like any other child. He played basketball on his school team, and even though he wasn't the best player, he never gave up. His coach said Lucas had the strongest fighting spirit he'd ever seen in a child. And on Lucas's wrist, the star bracelet Grace had left him the night she walked away all those years ago was still there. He never took it off, even though it was old and worn. even though he'd grown so much. It was a reminder of the woman who had taught him to believe in himself, the woman he now called Mom. Grace, 32, had become the woman she once only dared to dream of. She ran the Little Warriors Center, a free physical therapy center for children from poor families, children with hardships like her brothers long ago. Every day, she helped dozens of children, teaching them how to walk, how to believe in themselves, how to never give up. And at home, she had another little angel, 2-year-old Emma, with blue eyes just like her father's and a warm smile just like her mother's. But no matter how busy she was, Grace always made time for Lucas. She still called him Little Warrior. She still trained with him every afternoon in the back garden. Alexander, 42, had left the underworld completely behind. The infamous Mafia boss of years past was now a legitimate businessman, owner of a chain of restaurants and hotels, and the biggest sponsor of children's charities in the city. He came home at 6 o'clock every evening, never late, never letting work matter more than family. He had learned that lesson 5 years earlier, when he'd nearly lost the son he hadn't even known he loved so much. Daniel, Grace's brother, had graduated from college with a degree in physical therapy and now worked at his sister's center. The 22-year-old young man who once couldn't walk normally was now helping other children fight through the same kind of hardship he'd faced. Mrs. Sarah Mitchell, Grace's mother, lived with the family in the mansion. She was healthy, happy, surrounded by the people she loved. Every day, she cooked good meals for everyone, told fairy tales to Emma, and watched Lucas play ball with the proud eyes of a grandmother. One weekend afternoon, the whole family sat in the back garden where everything had begun. Alexander sat in a chair, Emma asleep in his arms. Grace sat beside him, her head resting on her husband's shoulder. Lucas sat on the grass, looking up at the sky turning pink and orange with sunset. "Dad," Lucas said, "do you remember the day you came home early and saw me helping Aunt Grace clean the floor?" Alexander smiled, remembering that night as if it had happened yesterday. "How could I forget?" he said. "That was the day my life changed forever." Lucas nodded. "Mine too." "How so?" Alexander asked. Lucas turned to his father, his blue eyes bright. "Because that was the first day you looked at me like I was special in a good way, not special in a sad way." Something tightened in Alexander's throat. He gently settled Emma into Grace's lap, then moved to sit beside his son and pulled the boy into his arms. "You were always special, Lucas," he whispered. "I was just too blind to see it, and I'm sorry it took me so long." Grace moved closer to the two of them, one hand holding Alexander's, one hand holding Lucas's. "We were all exactly where we needed to be, when we needed to be there," she said softly. "Everything happened for a reason. All the pain, all the struggles, they all led us to this moment, to each other." They sat in silence for a while, watching the sunset, feeling each other's warmth. Then Lucas spoke again, his voice unexpectedly thoughtful for a 9-year-old. "Mom, Dad, you know what I learned from all this?" Grace looked at her son. "What, sweetheart?" Lucas smiled, the smile of a warrior who had won. "That angels don't always have wings. Sometimes they wear aprons and have hearts full of love." Alexander looked at Grace, the woman who had saved his son, who had saved his whole life. He smiled, a smile only she could truly see. "You're absolutely right, little warrior," he said. "You're absolutely right." And that was the story of how a feared Mafia boss, a housekeeper with a tragic fate, and a small boy with a warrior's heart found one another, and found the true meaning of family. This story gives us valuable lessons about life, that sometimes the angels who enter our lives don't come in the form we expect, that love can change anyone, even the coldest hearts, that it's never too late to become a better father, a better mother, a better person, and that children, no matter how small or fragile, deserve to be loved, believed in, and given a chance to shine. If this story touched your heart, please share it with your loved ones. Please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss more moving stories every day. How do you feel about this story? Have you ever met an angel in an apron in your own life? Share with us in the comments below. We'd love to hear what's in the deepest part of your heart. Thank you for staying with us until the very end. We wish you and your family good health, a joyful life, peaceful days filled with love. Goodbye, and we'll see you in the next video.